Thank you. Good morning for having me, Bosun.
Yes, thank you. Give us just 1 minute what this transfer pricing law is all about in summary.
Yeah, so, in summary, the rules are supposed to guide the manner in which related parties price transactions between one another. So it's always been a concern for the tax authorities because the pricing of transactions between related parties impacts the profits that they recognize in Nigeria, and that then impacts the taxes that they pay in Nigeria. So in order to ensure that mispricing does not happen and to ensure that the tax authorities and governments does not lose out on taxes they should get, transfer pricing regulations are typically introduced. And what we found now is there's been a new set of regulations to replace the regulations we had in the past, which was initially enacted in 2012.
Yes, thank you. Put it in summary. If we break it down to the man on the street, the Nigerian government wants multinationals, well, technically speaking, foreign companies doing business in Nigeria to pay the right amount of tax to the FIRS. Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Absolutely. And the new law,
Absolutely.
And the new law, therefore, in the new rules around these tax matters for multinationals or foreign companies doing business here, relates to how their businesses in Nigeria, if they are declaring the right profit and the right tax to the Nigerian government. Yes or no?
Yeah, that's correct. So the rules try to ensure that when multinationals have transactions with their related parties, and remember, because we're a net importer of goods, services, and even technology, there tends to be a lot of cross-border transactions between Nigerian subsidiaries of multinationals and their parents. So the rules are there to ensure that when those transactions happen, the transactions are actually priced at arm's length. In layman's terms, you can say market price. So it's to ensure that the relationship between those parties that are dealing does not impact those transactions, and the transaction prices reflect the fair market value, such that those prices have not negatively influenced the profits that are recorded in Nigeria for tax purposes.
Yeah, okay. If we take a typical example, so you have company A, headquartered somewhere else in Africa, somewhere in Europe, in China, but it's doing business. It has a subsidiary operating in Nigeria. So this new transfer pricing relates to how this same company with headquarters outside the shores of Nigeria do business, or what you call the third party transaction, with the Nigerian unit, which is here, and how much of that money is declared and upon which tax are assessed by the Inland Revenue Service of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Yeah, so it basically deals with how they price those transactions. And obviously, the tax authorities are interested because the price eventually impacts the profit. And that's the main interest. So the thing to note is we've always had transfer pricing regulations since 2012. So what we have now is some form of update to those regulations. And when I look at the new regulations, there are
let's look at the old regulation.
Themes that
I'm sorry,
out.
With due respect, may I cut in here? Sheon, please, respectfully, please.
Yes.
What was the regulation we had as at 2012 on transfer pricing? Let's piggyback on that.
Yeah, so it was also, a transfer pricing regulation that was put in place to address, transfer pricing issues. But what we have, or what has happened is those regulations have been updated to reflect some of the more recent thinking around transfer pricing and international tax. So you'd find that, for example, sometime between 2012 2015, there was a project that was driven by the OECD, G20, and some other countries where they were looking at the current, at that time, international tax rules and transfer pricing rules. And they were trying to see what updates needed to be made to those rules to ensure that they could address the current commercial realities. at the end of that project, there was a report that was issued called the BEPS report. And what we are seeing now with the 2018 transfer pricing regulations is Nigeria is picking up some of the recommendations from that report. So the idea is to tighten up somewhat the transfer pricing regulations. The other thing you'd also find, in the regulations is it tries to adopt some of the more recent thinking in the African tax space around transfer pricing. Reason being, when that international project was going on, African tax authorities were also having a parallel conversation, and the feeling amongst them was the project did not address all the African-specific, circumstances. So, some of the concerns they had was, we are net importers of services, technology, commodities, and they felt it was important to have specific rules that related more to the African environment. So they came up with their own, suggested legislation around those issues. So what you find with the new rules is the new rules borrow from some of those suggested approaches. So basically it combines, new thinking internationally as well as new thinking from an African perspective, all in a bid to ensure that the government does not lose revenue through abusive transfer pricing.
I'm going to ask you a very direct question. Are there reports or what I can call market hearsay out there that multinationals do play games with the country where they operate, where their headquarters is somewhere else?
No, there's always the feeling, right, within the government that they may be losing out, right? And what these regulations try to do is to give the government the opportunity to ensure that they are not actually losing out through transfer pricing. So the interesting thing about the regulations is it looks into addressing either deliberate or, accidental transfer, mispricing. But what he also does is it sets out clear rules that the government will follow when assessing the appropriateness of those transfer prices. So that then means that the multinationals can have a look at those rules and try to comply with it. Because in the past, when there were no clear rules, it was really hard to know what needed to be done and how it needed to be done. But now with these rules, multinationals have an opportunity to have a look at those rules and try their best to comply and ensure they pay the right amount of taxes.
So how do we hit the ground running with the new rules? How and when?
Yeah, so it's important to do that as soon as possible, particularly when you consider the fact that these new rules introduce penalties. And some of those penalties are pretty significant. So it's really important for companies that will be affected to look into their transfer pricing compliance and ensure that they are compliant with all the requirements. They also need to look at their business structures, their transactions, to ensure that they don't run foul of the new transfer pricing rules. So it's important to have an impact assessment to see how the rules will affect you and ensure that you can comply. And it's also important to start to take immediate steps to ensure that you do not run foul of those rules, particularly because of the materiality of some of the penalties that have been introduced.
I like it when it comes to materiality of penalties. You do the crime, you do the time. That's the word out there. So how hefty are the penalties that Nigerian government will slam on any multinational that misbehaved on transfer pricing?
So what you have is, in several instances, you have a minimum penalty of 10 million naira. But when you consider the fact that we're coming from a situation where the penalties were as low as 25,000 naira, you see it's a big step, right? You could also have a situation where
from 25,000 naira to 10 million naira?
1% of...
You mean the previous penalty was 25,000 naira? So a multinational don't pay the right tax to Nigerian authorities, and the company, this international company doing business in Nigeria, gets fined 25,000 naira.
So let me put that in context, right? The penalties I'm talking about are penalties for not filing returns that are due under the regulations, right? There are different penalties for underpayment of tax, right? So those are, percentages of the tax amounts that have not been paid. But there are certain returns you are supposed to file periodically. And some of those returns are transfer pricing returns. So in the past, there were no specific penalties for not filing those returns. So this has nothing to do with, mispricing in itself, but it's more of a compliance issue, which is, are there forms you are supposed to fill every year and submit? So in the past, there were no penalties, specific penalties per se. So what we have now is specific penalties have been introduced to impact persons that fail to make those returns to the government when due. So this is totally different from, the crime of under-declaring taxes or not paying the right amount of taxes. It's more about complying with the statutory requirements around filing returns relating to transfer pricing. So the other important thing to point out is the transfer pricing rules do not just impact multinationals that are headquartered outside Nigeria. So it's something that impacts all group companies, whether headquartered locally or abroad, so far as they have transactions with related parties.
Okay, Seun, the final question, a quick one. Which government agency is responsible to handling this new transfer pricing rule?
So this is the Federal Inland Revenue Service.
Thank you so much. Seun Adu, a partner and the head of transfer pricing business at PwC. We'll come back after the break. You're watching Business Morning.